So it's probably safe to say that 2025 hasn't exactly been a banner year for aviation news. We started the year off with the crash in DC when a military helicopter collided with a passenger plane, killing 67 people. Then there was the medevac crash in Philadelphia, which killed 7 people, including an 11-year-old pediatric patient. Then the commuter plane in Alaska, which took 10 lives because it was 1,000 pounds overloaded. And of course, who can forget the infamous Delta flight that somehow managed to crash land upside down without killing anyone? So with all this airplane news, it got me thinking about other plane crashes of history because, well, I have a morbid curiosity, and to be honest, that's why this channel exists in the first place. And also probably because the idea of being in a plane crash is so terrifying to me that researching them is somehow my way of facing that fear in some completely irrational, illogical way. Because if you research plane crashes, maybe in some cosmic way, there's less of a chance of being in one, right? I would like to think that I would be one of those people who would have a Zen-like acceptance in the face of death, but fingers crossed, I hope I don't have to find out. There have, of course, been many devastating plane crashes over the last few decades. Some of them get more media attention than others. For instance, TWA Flight 800, that was all over the news in the 90s. Then we had MH370, which was the plane that completely vanished. And to be honest, I haven't gone down the MH370 rabbit hole because I have a feeling it would consume my entire being. And then there are some plane crashes that I feel like we just kind of forgot about. Like Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, which I know that wasn't a mechanical failure, that was straight up murder. So maybe technically it doesn't belong in the same kind of aviation disaster category as some of these other plane crashes, but it was an aviation disaster nonetheless. Remember, this was the plane that was shot down by Russian forces while it was flying over Ukraine, and nearly 300 people died. And to this day, there's been no real justice. 3 guys were convicted, but of course, Russia never extradited them so that they could serve their sentences. So basically, the moral of the story of MH17 is that you can murder 300 civilians and get away with it as long as you have a certain Russian leader on your side. Also, let's just note what a terrible year 2014 was for Malaysia Airlines. Both MH370 and MH17 were within just a few months of each other.
For an airplane to disappear is not normal.
But the plane crash that's been on my mind lately is Japan Airlines Flight 123. This was a 747 jet that crashed in 1985, so we're coming up on the 40-year anniversary of this plane crash as of this video. And so far, it remains the deadliest single aircraft disaster in history. But despite it being the deadliest, what makes this story stand out for me is that some people actually survived. This isn't a typical plane crash story where something catastrophic happens and then everyone's dead seconds later. This is a story that played out over an unsettling period of time. Enough time for people to understand what was happening and to have the presence of mind to write their goodbye letters to loved ones. It's a really heartbreaking and terrifying story, as most plane crash stories are, but for 4 people, it was a story of survival and human resilience. And of course, it's a story about the compounding effects of human error, because as history has shown us, when you add screw up upon screw up, the math really doesn't work out in your favor, especially for us common folks who have to fly commercial airliners. So let's dive into Flight 123. That was probably not the best phrasing. It's a warm summer evening in Japan. One of the country's most popular annual festivals is beginning the next day, so a lot of people are flying home to be with their families. This festival is called Obon, which is a Buddhist tradition to honor the spirits of ancestors who are believed to return to visit their families during this time. As you can see, the foreshadowing here is pretty dark. Flight 123 is completely booked. 524 passengers and crew on board, and they're expecting a short, routine trip from Tokyo to Osaka, a flight that should take about an hour. The plane lifts off, the sky's clear, and everything seems normal. But what nobody knows is that this plane is a ticking time bomb, and it's been a ticking time bomb for 7 years up to this point. In 1978, this very same aircraft suffered tailstrike damage during a landing at Osaka Airport. Boeing handled the repairs, and that didn't work out too well. The damage that they repaired was to the rear pressure bulkhead. This is a critical part of the plane's structure. It's basically a giant metal wall at the back of the fuselage that keeps the passenger cabin pressurized. But Boeing's repair crew did it all wrong. Engineers needed to add a reinforcement plate to make sure the fasteners had enough support, but fitting this plate into place was tricky, so instead of keeping it as one solid piece, Boeing's team opted for a shortcut that violated their own safety guidelines by using 2 pieces. That shortcut turned out to be a lethal mistake. The original design had multiple rows of fasteners to evenly distribute the stress across the bulkhead, but by splitting the plate, the entire load was now being held by just one row of fasteners. This decision to cut the plate in half for convenience created a weak point that, over the years and 12,000 flights later, got weaker and weaker until it hit its breaking point on August 12, 1985. 12 minutes after takeoff, as the plane is reaching 24,000 feet, there's a huge boom that shakes the plane. This is the moment the bulkhead fails. This is also the moment that the entire vertical stabilizer, which is the massive fin on the back of the plane, just rips off. And with the vertical stabilizer gone, so is every single hydraulic line. All 4 of them are gone. Hydraulics control everything: steering, climbing, descending. Without them, the pilots essentially have no control over the plane. It would be like driving your car at 70 miles an hour when suddenly the steering wheel stops turning and the brakes go out. That's pretty much what's happening here, except they're 24,000 feet in the air and flying hundreds of miles per hour. And yet the pilots are trying their hardest to keep the plane up. They have zero hydraulic control, and yet somehow are able to keep this plane in the air for 32 agonizing minutes. What they did was really extraordinary. They used engine thrust to steer, and by increasing power on one side and decreasing it on the other, they could slowly nudge the plane left or right, and by adjusting the thrust from both engines, they managed to control the pitch of the plane. They were able to climb or descend slightly when they needed to. Obviously, this was not a precise method, and it was incredibly hard, but it was all they had.
現在コントロールできますか？了解。どうぞ。はい。そんなことですね。入った。はい。
They tried to get the plane to an airport in Tokyo, even though they had to have known that a successful landing was next to impossible. But they really just refused to stop fighting for the lives of everyone on board. And it should be noted that during the investigation after the crash, they put multiple flight crews through this exact same simulation, and they all crashed the plane much quicker than these pilots did. So with the plane pretty much out of control, it starts lurching violently. It's climbing and then suddenly drops, sometimes at angles of 40 degrees or more. The passengers obviously know that something horrible has happened, but they don't really know what's happening. And with the cabin depressurized, the cold air from outside starts forming a white mist that's swirling around them. Some people are screaming, some are praying, and other people start grabbing napkins and scraps of paper and anything they can to write their goodbye notes to their loved ones, because they know how this is going to end. One passenger named Hirotsuku Kawaguchi used pages from his pocket calendar to write his goodbyes. "Be good to each other and work hard," he said. "Help your mother. It's sad, but I'm sure I won't make it." And finally, after 32 minutes of unthinkable chaos and fear, the plane slams into the side of Mount Takamagahara. And at that speed and at that force, you would think everyone would die on impact. But as it turns out, at least 20 or more people survived the initial crash. So here they are laying on the side of a mountain, exposed to the elements while the plane wreckage burns around them. And this is where the story gets really infuriating. A Japanese military helicopter actually spotted the wreckage that night, but they didn't spot any sign of life. Which, I mean, of course you're not going to spot any sign of life. If you actually survive a plane crash like that, you're not just going to get up and brush the dirt off your clothes and start waving around for help. And instead of sending in rescuers immediately, they waited, because they just assumed no one could have survived. They finally sent in help 14 hours later. So imagine this: you survive a plane crash, you're laying there on the side of a mountain, you're bleeding, every bone in your body is broken, your family and friends are dying or lay dead around you, and now you have to spend the night on the side of a mountain. So of course, by the time rescuers finally arrived the next morning, most of the survivors had died overnight. In the end, only 4 people were found alive. This includes 12-year-old Keiko Kawakami, who was found wedged between rows of seats, and when she was rescued, she said she'd been speaking with her father and sister after the crash, but they both died waiting for rescue. Another survivor was a 26-year-old off-duty flight attendant named Yumi Ochiai, and finally there's 34-year-old Hiroko Yoshizaki and her 8-year-old daughter Mikiko. Hiroko said the happiest moment of her 3-month stay in hospitals was when her daughter was finally able to get out of bed and walk around. All of the survivors had been seated in the back 7 rows of the plane, which was the only part of the plane to remain intact. Unfortunately, the death toll for Flight 123 would climb higher, and these were victims who weren't even on the plane. 2 employees of Japan Airlines, a maintenance manager and an engineer who had inspected the aircraft, took their own lives out of guilt. The CEO of Japan Airlines, Yasumoto Takagi, showed accountability for the disaster by resigning. At a memorial for the victims, he bowed in front of the families and asked for forgiveness while accepting responsibility. And not only that, he actually traveled the country afterwards to offer his personal apology to victims' families. Clearly, something had gone terribly wrong under his leadership. But unlike a lot of executives who tried to disappear behind statements and legal teams, Takagi actually showed up. He showed compassion, and he pushed for sweeping reforms across the airline industry. Boeing also implemented improved training and oversight for their maintenance technicians, though it would appear that they could use a refresher course here and there. This accident also really showed the stark cultural differences between Japan and the United States when it comes to how executive leadership responds to a disaster, because you almost never see that kind of accountability from corporate executives here in the States. The crash of Flight 123 remains the deadliest single aircraft crash in history, and while hundreds of families were shattered that day, 4 people did survive. And in the middle of so much loss and grief, there are stories that continue to inspire, like the crew's fight to save lives and a country's collective grief that demanded change. And finally, if you're watching this before getting on a plane, why?